There are very few extraordinary figures in Canadian public life, but I'm delighted to say that today I am joined by one of them, Irwin Cotler, former Justice Minister of Canada, a relentless and unwavering advocate for human rights, and a staunch defender of the State of Israel. Irwin, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John, and for those humbling introductory remarks.
Well, let me start with an anecdote rather than a question. I remember meeting you at a Tim Hortons in your riding of Mount Royal in 2011. You were in a close race, certainly closer than your race in 1999 when you won 92% of the vote. In 2011, many Jewish voters in the riding had moved to support the Harper Conservatives, but you still won, and I think that was because of your reputation in other communities. And I remember a Filipino man coming up to shake your hand, and he said, "We are very privileged to have you. How many people in the world are like you?" And I think there was a faith and a devotion that transcended party politics in a way that I haven't seen before or since. I don't think anybody else would have been re-elected in that riding at that time. So that's to give our watchers and readers a measure of the man that we're dealing with here. Can we turn to the disturbing news which emerged recently, that you've been targeted by Iran in retribution for your fight against that oppressive regime? A year ago you found out from the RCMP that there was credible evidence of an imminent and lethal threat against you. Since then you've had 24/7 protection. You've had overwhelming support from Canada and abroad. I know both houses of Parliament were unanimous in condemnation. But is the threat still there, and how is it affecting your daily life?
Well, the threat is still there in the sense that I'm still the beneficiary of the 24/7 protection, and I want to say that protection is exemplary. It began, as you said, in November 2023, when I first heard of the threat and was warned at the time that they had credible evidence of an imminent and lethal threat. I did not speak about it at the time or since, which included a month ago when I was supposed to attend the 60th anniversary of my law school graduating class, very much looking forward to it, but then was advised that day that there was an imminent and lethal threat of an assassination within 48 hours. Did not attend and still did not speak about it. Then the story broke in the Canadian and international media. Then, as you mentioned, both houses of Parliament adopted resolutions of condemnation of Iran. I learned early in 2025 that it was Iran that was the source of the threat, but as I said, did not speak about it and only began to respond to media requests when the story broke publicly in the House of Commons, voted as it did. But my situation remains the same as it was since November 2023. As I mentioned, the protection has been exemplary, and I just go about my life as if there was no threat, because I think the intention of these threats is to silence, to intimidate, to harass, and if we indulge that, then of course the threatening people like the Iranian regime and the like will have succeeded. And my main work, as I've always said, is on behalf of the Iranian people, who are the ongoing targets of Iranian regime's massive domestic repression. What we have here is a confluence both of massive domestic repression and transnational repression and assassination, where they target those, in the case of Iran, but also true amongst the other members of the axis of evil, Russia and China, they target those who support their domestic constituencies. And that's why it's not only in terms of combating the Iranian regime, it's in terms of standing up in solidarity with the brave Iranian people.
Why do you think now? I mean, you've been an outspoken critic of Iran for many, many years. Has it got anything to do with the Revolutionary Guard Corps being designated a terror organization, which happened in Canada?
I think it has something to do with that. I first proposed that the IRGC be listed as a terrorist organization in 2008, and it took until June 2024 until it happened. I've also been advocating that the other G7 countries, apart from the US, do the same, and recommended that the whole issue of transnational repression and assassination be put on the agenda, the next G7 meeting, as a matter of principle and priority, and Canada's hosting that meeting. But I think it's happened because it's been escalating. The transnational repression and assassination has been escalating since 2020, and in particular after October 7th. If we recall, in the first Trump administration, both the then National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and his Secretary of State, Pompeo, were both targeted for assassination. And more recently, my colleague and friend, Masih Alinejad, a leading Iranian dissident living in New York, who's been a great leader in the women life freedom movement for the people of Iran, has herself been the target of threatened abduction and assassination. And since, as I said, October 7th, the targeting has manifested itself in various places in Europe, America, and the like. So I think we even just saw recently a rabbi who was murdered in the UAE, and where it is suspected that Iran hired local contractors or hired assassins to do it. So we're seeing this now escalating, and I'm just one illustration of it.
So you've spoken about transnational repression for many years. 5 years ago, you talked about a historical inflection moment characterized by a resurgent global authoritarianism. And then last week, there was a Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights webinar that you spoke at, and you went maybe a stage further, and you talked about a concerted axis of evil represented by Russia, China, and Iran and their proxies that is waxing as increasingly polarized democracies wane. Are we in Canada and in the West awake to the notion that this threat is increasingly coordinated? And are we responding vigorously enough?
No, I don't think we're yet awake. I have mentioned that I was hoping that the assassination attempt with regard to myself would not be personalized, but would be seen as a wake-up call, for Canada and what is happening elsewhere, as I mentioned, a wake-up call for the community of democracies, because we're now at another historical inflection moment, and that is the concerted, intensifying axis of evil involving, as you mentioned, Russia, China, Iran, and their proxies. But the worst part about it is not only the internal polarization amongst the democracies and its backsliding, which prevents a concerted response on the other hand, but the real problem has been the ongoing culture of impunity in the face of the transnational repression. For example, if you take Russia, the 21st century began with Putin's Russia, and again I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics of Russia who are the targets of massive domestic repression, as I always say, also Khamenei's Iran. And the 21st century began with Putin going into Chechnya, then invading Georgia, then seizing Crimea, and so on. And so I guess Putin thought to himself, well, if I could do all these things and was able to do so without any accountability, why should anybody care if I go into Ukraine, which is not an independent country, it's not an independent people? And so that culture of impunity incentivized Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people, however, responded with great courage and continue to do so. And that was a wake-up call by Ukraine for the community of democracies as to how one has to respond. That's why in a recent meeting with the Prime Minister, I suggested to him that the issue of combating this intensified, concerted axis of evil and their proxies requires a mobilized community of democracies that takes action to combat this culture of impunity.
And you specifically suggested a department be created, or there be a specific response to transnational repression, right?
Yes, I suggested that there be an independent department or agency of government because the constituents of transnational repression are not limited. As you know, we have here in Canada foreign interference inquiry, but that one, its mandate has been regarding foreign interference during elections. That is important, but it's more expanded than that. The transnational repression is dealing, as I said, with the confluence of transnational repression and domestic repression, of transnational misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, cyber security threats, of the extraterritorial targeting of in the various countries that are so targeted amongst the community of democracies. Take Canada, for example, of the targeting of the leaders of the Iranian diaspora, journalists, human rights defenders, dissidents, and the like. And so what we have here is a critical mass of transnational repression and, more recently, as I said, assassination that can only be addressed with an independent department and agency, so that departments and agencies of government don't operate in silos like they do now with justice, public safety, foreign global affairs. They need to work in concert. They need to work actively with regard to a honed strategy and action re transnational repression. And we need a national reporting system where victims know where they can report and how to report, and that too will provide a protective mechanism as well as a voice for the victim. So government has to be mobilized for that purpose, and what I recommend for Canada, I hope, will be replicated amongst the G7 countries, and I trust that the road to and our hosting of the next G7 can help bring this about.
Let's turn to Israel. You've been at the forefront of defining what I think you called a new anti-Semitism, where you say that much of what is purported to be criticism of Israel is tantamount to demonization. Yet there is internal criticism within Israel, as you know. Moshe Yaalon, a former defense minister and as chief of the Israeli Defense Force, said last week that Israel is carrying out ethnic cleansing in the north of Gaza and worries the country is losing its identity as a liberal democracy. The concern is that right-wingers in Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition want to reduce the Gazan population to open land up for settlement. So where does legitimate criticism of Israel end and demonization begin?
Well, criticism of Israel, like any other democracy, is legitimate. And as you can see by the statement by Moshe Yaalon in Israel, it is alive and well within Israel itself. I myself was part of that criticism during the year prior to October 7th, when the Netanyahu government initiated what they called a judicial reform proposal, and I was one of those that was harshly critical of that proposal because I felt that was itself attacking some of the well springs of Israeli democracy. The protests and the demonstrations prevailed, and that proposal never was adopted. So I think within Israel you've got healthy criticism, and that demonstrates that, yes, you can criticize and criticize harshly, and I have been part of that as well. Where it crosses the line is where it engages in what my colleague, former political prisoner, Natan Sharansky, has called the 3 Ds. When it comes into the delegitimization, demonization, as you mentioned, and double standards, where you single out the state of Israel for selective opprobrium and indictment within an ongoing demonizing, delegitimizing, dehumanizing framework and the relevant tropes and conspiratorial tropes in that regard. So to conclude, and let me be very clear on this, Israel, like any other state, is responsible for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And Israel and the Jewish people do not deserve to have any privilege or preference because of the horrors of the Holocaust or other horrors of Jewish history. But the problem is not that Israel should seek, or that anyone should seek on its behalf, that Israel be above the law. The problem is that it's systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena. Not that it must respect human rights, which it must, but its equal rights deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards should not be applied to Israel. They must be. That's what equality before the law is all about. But these standards must be applied equally to all others. So what concerns me is, on the one hand, the culture of impunity that has been enjoyed, as I said, by the axis of evil and their major human rights violators, and the singling out of a democracy, however imperfect, for selective opprobrium and indictment. I can give many examples of the weaponization of international law and international institutions in that regard, but just one, that every year the UN General Assembly adopts some 15 to 18 resolutions in condemnation of Israel. And again, I'm saying there can be resolutions of condemnation, but only around 5 resolutions against the rest of the world combined. And for example, no resolutions against China. That's what I mean about singling out a democracy for selective opprobrium and indictment.
I think I'm right in saying that when you were in government, you shifted Canada's position on those votes.
Yes, it was in the government of Paul Martin where we began that shift, and that shift continued with the Harper government. And I think it's important, not in terms of it providing protection for Israel, but in terms of the UN being the institution we wished it to be. I still remember when I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, saying to me something that I never forgot, when he said that a UN that does not put the combating of anti-Semitism at the forefront of its agenda is a United Nations that has betrayed its past and forfeited its future. So that's the lens under which I operate, equality before the law for all states within the UN, because I am a supporter of the UN and its founding ideals.
Let's stick with international law. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, saying the court has reasonable grounds to believe they bear criminal responsibility for war crimes. Canada's Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, has said that as a founding member of the ICC, Canada needs to apply international law to all parties at all times. The implication being that Canada would hand over Netanyahu if he came to this country. Justin Trudeau featured you in a tweet, the picture of the two of you meeting. He didn't say that you endorsed the government's position, but I think the implication was there. But you've in fact been very critical of that decision, of the prosecutor, and I'm guessing of Canada's response. Can you talk us through your views on this and what you told the Prime Minister?
Yes, I did meet with the Prime Minister, as you mentioned, and I did bring up the question of the ICC warrants. I also talked to him about, among other things, what we mentioned, transnational repression and assassination. But on the ICC, I've been a long-time supporter for the creation of an international criminal court. I even served as a special advisor to then Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy on the road to the adoption of the Rome Treaty and the ICC statute. And one of my first acts when I was elected to Parliament, as you mentioned, I was elected in a by-election in November 1999. One of my first acts was to co-sponsor legislation for the domestication of the ICC statute, Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And that continued my support for the ICC. It was precisely because of that, as I mentioned to the Prime Minister, yes, Canada is as he put it, a founder of the ICC, and yes, we are supporters of the ICC, and yes, we want to support decisions of the ICC. But the ICC has to itself comport with its own founding principles. In this instance, the special prosecutor, Karim Khan, with whom I had and continue to have a good relationship, I supported his candidacy, as did Canada, as election as ICC prosecutor. But here, in my view, both in him seeking arrest warrants and in the ICC pretrial chamber granting those arrest warrants, as you mentioned, for 2 Israeli leaders and one Hamas leader who's presumed dead, Mohammed Deif. The ICC and its process breached its own foundational principles, the first being the principle of complementarity. In a word, the ICC is a court of last resort. It is not supposed to substitute its judgment and jurisdiction where there exists an independent legal system, in particular within a democracy, and, as Karim Khan said of the Israeli system, a robust and independent judiciary that is willing and able to conduct that independent inquiry. Which brings me to the second principle, which has been breached, and perhaps even more seriously, and that is a principle that, to Karim Khan's credit, he espoused and acts upon, and that is the principle of cooperation. That is, that he will cooperate with a country in respect of which there may be prospective arrest warrants to be applied, in order to give that country the opportunity to engage in cooperation and complementarity. And so, in that regard, I helped facilitate, at Karim Khan's request, a meeting between Karim Khan and the Israeli leadership. It was scheduled to take place on May 20th within the spirit of cooperation. Regrettably, at the last minute, Karim Khan peremptorily canceled that meeting as an ICC staff was about to depart that day for Israel, and for him to join it. I happened to be in Israel at the time and recall it very well. And instead of participating in a cooperative framework and allowing for complementarity to be exercised, Karim Khan, as I said, canceled the trip and peremptorily issued the arrest warrants. And one final point here, which has not been appreciated, the month before that, Karim Khan, in the spirit of cooperation, went to Venezuela, met with Venezuelan dictator Maduro. And by the way, I'm a member of an independent panel of legal experts in the OAS with respect to whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity are being committed in Venezuela. We reported in 2018 that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed. In the light of that, Chrystia Freeland, then our foreign minister, initiated the first ever collective referral of a state party, Venezuela, to the ICC. We produced 2 other reports in 2021 and again in 2024, where we stated not only that these crimes against humanity were continuing, but that Maduro, on the road to the election in Venezuela, had effectively dismantled any opposition, any semblance of an independent judiciary, any semblance of a legal system of parliamentary opposition and the like. And yet, here, Karim Khan decided, after he met with Maduro, not to institute arrest warrants. When I discussed the question of Israel, he said to me, well, Irwin, no one is above the law. And I said, you're right. And I'm not saying that any Israeli official should be above, but they deserve equality before the law. And to go ahead and institute arrest warrants preemptively when Israel has, as you put it, a robust, independent legal system, and where the principle of cooperation, which you espouse to your credit, has been breached, what we have here is a denial of equality before law. So yes, I've remained critical of the ICC's decision and the actions taken by Karim Khan. I still hold him in high regard. I've mentioned, to the Israeli leadership that, and that was even before the question of arrest warrants were instituted, that they should have established an independent commission of inquiry into October 7th and thereafter. I still believe that should be done, but that doesn't preclude, the criticism I've made for the reasons that I've made. And I'm afraid sometimes when people work within the UN system, and I have high regard for the UN for the reasons I mentioned, they then tend to get involved in some group think and rely sometimes on evidence from flawed sources. And I think that occurred in the case of Karim Khan. That's the only way I can explain it.
Well, 2 quick questions to round that off. One, it seems to follow that you don't think Canada is obliged to abide by that decision. And two, if you recommended an independent state commission of inquiry to the Israeli government, what has been its response?
So number one, I do not believe that Canada is obliged to institute arrest warrants for the reasons I mentioned. On the contrary, because we're a supporter of the court and a founder of the court, as the Prime Minister mentioned, we are obliged to protect the integrity of the court, and where there's a breaching of its foundational principles, then we're not obliged to go along and become a party to that. I might add that, you know, other democracies in the G7 have taken positions, not just France, which said it believes that Netanyahu has immunity, or Germany that said it would not go along, or Italy, etc., but the United States, which both the Democrats and Republicans, which called the seeking of arrest warrants and then the issuance of arrest warrants, and I'm using, you know, the language of President Biden when he called it outrageous and referred to what he called a false moral equivalence of having arrest warrants against the, leaders of a democracy with an independent judiciary and robust independent institutions of press and the like, and a totalitarian country like Iran and its proxies in Hamas, which engaged in the worst of mass atrocities on October 7th. So it's this false moral equivalence that is also part of it. And regrettably, you know, the result of this action has been, and was clearly not intended by Karim Khan, but I told him that it could be the result of it, namely to incentivize anti-Semitism and, in fact, to be party to the weaponization of international law and international institutions. So I think Canada, we have a role and a responsibility to protect the integrity of international institutions like ICC, particularly where, as the Prime Minister and Melanie Joly said, we are a founder of it and want to abide by its principles and policies, but not when they breach their own foundational principles and policies.
And then the second point was, what's Israel's response been to your recommendation?
Well, thus far they have not taken it up. There have been investigations, I might add, hundreds of investigations that have been instituted with respect to alleged breaches of international human rights and humanitarian and criminal law by soldiers within the framework of Israel's response, self-defense response to Hamas mass atrocities. But they have not yet initiated two recommendations that I made: either an independent, commission, or an independent, prosecutorial inquiry, which would focus in particular on leadership crimes, let's say, allegedly committed by Netanyahu and Gallant, because there is a principle of the ICC with respect to same subjects, same crimes. In other words, the complementarity works if you investigate, the particular people who have been suspected of having committed the crimes, even if they are leaders of a democracy. So I also suggested an independent prosecutorial initiative, and I'm hopeful that one of those two initiatives will be taken up. But as I said, individual prosecutions or individual investigations have begun, and Israel does have a robust, independent legal system, and I trust that that will happen.
Just to finish up on Israel, the new anti-Semitism that you've talked about is combined a coalition of Western progressive organizations and Muslims who've immigrated to the West. It seems to me much of it is hatred of Israel. But there are well-meaning people who are disturbed by what they see as excessive violence from Israel. What, for example, should I tell my 20-year-old daughter who tells me she's upset that I am so ready to support Israel's right of self-defense, when in her view, the model of that self-defense has been to murder tens of thousands of civilians?
Well, I think, the fact that your daughter is engaged in these things is itself important, and I would respect the fact that she is engaged. So is my own children, and let us face it, they are also the products of social media, and there's been a lot of uploading on the social media of false misrepresentations. The first thing I would tell your daughter is what I mentioned before, that Israel, like any other state, even when it responds in self-defense, must be held accountable for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. I would also remind her that the self-defense would not have been necessary if the October 7th mass atrocities had not begun. That's what brought about this whole Israel-Hamas war. And tragically, the civilians, the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, whose suffering we all have witnessed, and indeed one has to, in fact, seek to protect against that kind of suffering. But that's the point, that the Palestinian in Gaza have been held hostage to Hamas, which began this war and incentivizes its own casualties by using its own civilians and civilian infrastructure as human shields, by hiding its weapons and its terrorist command centers within mosques, within hospitals, within even UNRWA systems and the like. So it's that kind of weaponization of the international system by Hamas in such a way that it basically invites those types of casualties. And that's why I say the war also could have ended, that Hamas began on October 7th, if on October 8th they would have released the 250 hostages that they abducted and seized and took into captivity, where every day that those hostages are held in captivity is a standing war crime and crimes against humanity. On October 8th, if Hamas had returned those hostages, the war would have been over. But what Hamas did was to say, and I don't know if your daughter knows this, is that they will commit those atrocities, and I'm quoting the Hamas leadership, again and again and again. And that's why this horrific war, which has resulted in both, Israeli casualties, but horrific suffering for the Palestinians, the accountability has to be laid for those who began this war, which is Hamas, who continue this war, which is Hamas, and who maintain the hostages in captivity, which is Hamas, and not only aided and abetted, but armed and financed and trained and mobilized by Iran. And Hamas is a proxy of Iran, and so we get back to the whole axis of evil where all this began and where the accountability must take place. So I would, in some respect your daughter for being so engaged, for feeling compassion where compassion needs to be felt, but just to fill out the picture with respect to where responsibility lies for those horrific civilian casualties and suffering.
I know you've been an advocate for a two-state solution for many, many years, if not decades. Do you feel we're further away from that solution than we've ever been? Regrettably,
I feel we are further away. I founded the Canadian Professors for Peace in the Middle East then in 1970, and our foundational principles were two states for two peoples, which, as I said, presupposed the mutual acknowledgements of each state's people's right to self-determination and to statehood. Regrettably, we seem to be further away, because at this point, with respect to the Palestinian people, you've had either Hamas governing Gaza or the Palestinian Authority, which has yet to condemn the mass atrocities of October 7th, and which has as part of its policies, for example, a pay for slay, which means that for every terrorist act that is committed by a Palestinian against an innocent Israeli civilian, that terrorist gets a pension if he survives his own terrorist attack, or his family receives a pension if he's killed in that terrorist attack. That's an ongoing incentivization of terrorism. And I can go on. The main part now, I met with Mahmoud Abbas. We first met back in 1977 when he was in Damascus. We've had an ongoing relationship over the years. I think I'm, at the risk of sounding self-serving, one of the only people who may have received both a Presidential Medal of Honor from the Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog last year, but prior to that, and 10 years ago, a citation from the President of the Palestinian Authority, namely Mahmoud Abbas. And I was working for years to try to bring about, two states for two peoples and negotiations between Abbas and Netanyahu. Those things broke down, regrettably, as of 2015. And then the incentivization of terror began by the Palestinian Authority. They themselves acknowledged that they were going to engage then in lawfare, that is to say, the weaponization of international institutions. And then, of course, we had the tipping point, the October 7th mass atrocities. And it wasn't only, the worst of mass atrocity of horrors, too terrible to be believed but not too terrible, happened, the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust has been characterized. But the worst thing about it was the uploading by Hamas of the mass atrocities and the images of the horror as they were committing it. In other words, they were celebrating the mass atrocities. They were, in fact, glorifying the mass atrocities. And those kinds of atmospherics, when you have a situation of that traumatizing character, what has resulted is that in Israel, even the peace camp is further away from two states for two peoples. This right-wing Netanyahu government is further away from it. And the tragedy is those who were targeted in those mass atrocities, which were the peaceful kibbutzim that were neighboring Gaza, were all the leaders of the peace movement. I'll give one example. Vivian Silver, a Canadian Israeli, a staunch supporter of peace with the Palestinians, who used to bring Gazan Palestinians from Gaza to Israel for health care and the like, as a leader of the Women Wage Peace and Women Against War, etc., with regard to the Israel-Palestinian peace and so on. She was, horrifically murdered, and she was in fact targeted by people who knew of her great peaceful work. And as I say, I knew Vivian Silver well. She was not only an old friend of mine, an old girlfriend of mine. I remember accompanying her when she first went to live in Israel back in 1974, Kibbutz Gezer at the time, and then Kibbutz Be'eri, which were the target of those mass atrocities. So this has left the Israeli people traumatized. They still live in the shadow and pain of October 7th on the one hand, and regrettably, the Palestinian leadership not only has not at any time ever recanted those mass atrocities or sought to hold anybody accountable for it, but on the contrary, in the case of Hamas, says they will commit it again and again, glorifies and celebrates those mass atrocities, and the PA is yet to condemn it. So we've got, a real distancing between the two at this point. One people in Israel under trauma, another in Palestine, on the one hand, hostages to Hamas, and on the other hand, Hamas committed to maintaining and perpetuating those atrocities.
Let's change gears, turn to a brighter subject, I think, and that's your own storied career. You were born in 1940, the son of a lawyer who told you, well, you told me this, that he told you in Hebrew, "Justice, justice shall you pursue. This is the equal of all the other commandments combined." I since read that you were inspired to follow the civil and human rights path after going to a baseball game with him and watching Jackie Robinson play in Montreal when you were 6. Is that true?
That's true. And, my father was an avid baseball fan. He attended all the games he was able to at Delorme Stadium at the time in Montreal, and he took me there and actually introduced me to Jackie Robinson. You know, there are moments in life that have a lifelong impact, and I think, you know, I then, like many 6-year-olds, to the extent I was able to learn and read about Jackie, I then followed Jackie Robinson and followed the Brooklyn Dodgers, etc. But that was, if you will, a civil liberties moment for me, and I suspect that that and my mother's teaching to me, which was when she would hear my father say what, as you quoted him, would say to me that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice will be, as you would always tell me, you know, just a matter of theory, a matter of abstraction. And so, as a result of the teachings of my parents and great teachers that I had in high school and university and the like, I then got involved in the two great human rights movements of the second half of the 20th century, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and the struggle for human rights in the former Soviet Union, and got involved with the two political prisoners who were the face of those struggles, the voice, the identity of those struggles, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, who became our second honorary citizen, and Anatoly Sharansky in the former Soviet Union.
And he, well, let's talk about that. So you've represented many prisoners who were in prison because of their political beliefs. Sharansky, who was consigned to a Soviet gulag before his release in 1986, and he ended up becoming Israel's deputy prime minister, and you were instrumental in that process, I gather. And Nelson Mandela, whose cause you championed in South Africa in the early 1980s. And you're still doing it. The last time I saw you was on Parliament Hill in October 2022, when you were campaigning for the release of Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza, even though you were recovering from COVID and you had a blood clot and you weren't particularly well at the time. Is there a common lesson to be learned from dealing with repressive regimes as you've done down the years?
I think the important lesson is to realize that the people are putting not only their livelihoods but their lives on the line, as it was Mandela and those associated with him in South Africa, and Sharansky and those associated with him in the former Soviet Union, and the brave people of Iran and the like, or Jimmy Lai now in Hong Kong, and I'm part of his international legal team. I think we have a responsibility to side with, support, and engage with these heroic people, because they're really fighting for that which we aspire to and have been founded on, and that is they're struggling for democracy, they're struggling for freedom, they're struggling for human rights. These are foundational values of all of us, but they're putting their lives on the line for that. We here in the West can live in reasonable comfort and security, and I think the least we can do is to support them in their struggle. And they're the ones who've inspired me. And when I mentioned Jackie Robinson, inspired me to get involved in the civil rights movement in the U.S. when I was then a graduate student at Yale Law School and met with Martin Luther King Jr. and the like, was actually present at the time of his heroic speech. And those are the things that have been the inspirational role models for me. And Vladimir Kara-Murza, whom you mentioned, you know, he was charged and sentenced to 25 years in prison for the exact same charges that Sharansky had: treason and, if you will, anti-Russian slander and agitation, for doing nothing else but, you know, standing up for human rights of Russians and criticizing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He really is himself, Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's the intellectual heir of Andrei Sakharov, is the human rights heir to Anatoly Sharansky, a great human rights figure. I'm delighted that the two houses of the Canadian Parliament supported him becoming our most recent honorary citizen. I'm awaiting the honorary citizenship ceremony in the Canadian Parliament, which he is so deserving. He is perhaps the greatest heroic human rights figure that we have today.
Were you surprised that they let him out?
Well, it was political prisoner exchange.
Yeah.
Putin wanted one of his own, criminal collaborators released, and so he knew how much the West wanted Vladimir Kara-Murza and Gershkovich released and the others, and so it was in Vladimir's self-interest, as he saw it, Vladimir Putin, to release Vladimir Kara-Murza. But I have to say that since he's been released, he has been yet again, a heroic human rights figure addressing parliaments in Europe, the Congress in the US. Recently, he came on November 3rd to a tribute dinner that my wife organized on my behalf. Was a surprise guest for that dinner. He and his wife, Evgeny Kara-Murza, they're both heroic figures, and to have him here was a very inspirational moment, because he is, as I say today, perhaps the leading figure internationally with respect to the human rights advocacy and combating of impunity.
Amazing courage. Back to your career, you mentioned Yale Law School. You also had an early exposure to politics as John Turner's speechwriter when he was Justice Minister, I guess, in the late 60s. Did you think then you would pursue a career in politics?
No, I aspired then to be a law professor, which happily I became after my work with John Turner. I worked with him full-time for 2 years, 68 to 70, then part-time last 2 years of his mandate, 70 to 72, while I begun then my career as a law professor. But I have to say that John Turner, of blessed memory, was really one of the great inspirations in my life, because he taught me, among other things, a lesson that I never forgot, which was, as he used to always repeat to me, that democracy doesn't happen by accident. You have to nurture it. You have to protect it. You have to work for it. And he was a model, not just as a Minister of Justice and Attorney General, but he was a Minister of Justice and Attorney General who was engaged always in Parliament, in the parliamentary process, and doing exactly what he was seeking to teach me about it, namely to promote and protect, Parliament as the trustee of the people, and to always to ensure that we don't put partisan politics above that trusteeship. And that was something that I learned from him, and when I did become a member of Parliament, tried to follow it. And when, as I became a Minister of Justice and Attorney General, some 35 years after my work with John Turner, the lessons I got with him as my mentor were the most important lessons that I sought to apply when I was myself the Justice Minister and Attorney General.
I have to say, from my experience, you weren't the greatest partisan of all time, and I say that as a compliment. You were elected in 99, you became Justice Minister in 2003. Among other things, you listed Hezbollah as a terror organisation. You crafted the Civil Marriage Act that legalised gay marriage, appointed 2 female judges to the Supreme Court. Do you have any regrets about your time in Cabinet? Are there things that you didn't get done that you wanted to?
I have no regrets about the time that I was there. I have regrets that our mandate did not continue beyond February 2006. It was a short mandate under the leadership of Paul Martin. I still believe that he was one of the greatest prime ministers that we never had the opportunity to fully experience, his greatness and what he had in mind. For example, a priority for Paul Martin was, and he said this at our first cabinet meeting, I never forgot it, and that is that he said, we will be judged at the end of the day by what we do on behalf of the Indigenous people of Canada. And so, as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I made the issue of Indigenous justice a priority on my agenda, as the Prime Minister made it a priority on the Canadian agenda. And I had what I called the 7 R's of Indigenous justice that I won't go into now, but these became, a priority for me, and I regret that as one mandate that we could not more effectively continue. I did have the opportunity to appoint Harry Laforme as the first ever Indigenous justice of an appellate court in Canada, to the Ontario Court of Appeal. I recently met with Harry Laforme. I regretted that it took, until 2004 that an Indigenous person could be named to an appellate court of appeal, and he's been a great, great justice. I also had an opportunity to appoint the first black person to an appellate court of appeal, and that's a second thing that I regretted. I think one of the most important things of a Minister of Justice and Attorney General, the enduring legacy, is judicial appointments, because that lives long after those of us who have the temporary appointment of Minister of Justice and Attorney are no longer there. That, to me, was one of the most important and I felt rewarding parts of my tenure as Justice Minister, to appoint 2 women to the Supreme Court of Canada, and make it at that time the most gender equity court in the world, to appoint, as I said, the first Indigenous justice, first black man to appellate, and so on. That, to me, was an important thing that I'm sorry we did not able to continue, though we did establish during my tenure a merit-based judicial appointments process, which has continued to this day. The third thing that I regret very much is that when I was a Justice Minister, under Paul Martin's leadership and his encouragement, I went to the Middle East and met with Justice Ministers of Egypt and Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, and invited them all to a Justice Summit in Canada, which they all agreed to, and we agreed to the agenda. And I was very hopeful that would not only be a Justice Summit with an agreed-upon agenda, but it would have a peace dividend. And that Justice Summit was scheduled to take place around February 2006, but we got defeated in the election. And though I recommended to the Prime Minister Harper to continue with that initiative, regrettably, the Conservative government chose not to. I continued my own relationships with these justice ministers thereafter, but that Justice Summit was never held. And the final thing I think I regret was I was able to initiate the first prosecution under the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act against the leaders of the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. And I made, in that sense, the pursuit of justice, which, as you said, my father and mother teaching to me, try to make it a reality in terms of pursuing justice for victims and accountability for the human rights violators. I don't believe that that level of prosecutorial initiatives has continued and been sustained. I argued then, and still do, that the Department of Justice has to have a budget replenished and expanded for those pursuits of justice. In other words, for me, the pursuit of international justice was a priority, as well as domestic justice. I believe that the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and being part of a G7 country, has a unique role, if not responsibility, in that regard, and I regret that I was not able to continue with those initiatives.
One thing I regret you didn't get done was that you introduced a motion in about 2011, the National Speak No Evil Day. You called for citizens and MPs to take part in one day free from unfair criticism, bigoted comments, cruel jokes, or character assassination. Unfortunately, I think that would have shut down the House of Commons, and I don't even think it came to a vote, did it?
Yeah, but the irony about that, it's not some of the irony, the person who asked me to do that was my mother, of blessed memory, because she, I never heard her say something bad about anybody in my life. I mean, she was the one who actually encouraged me to meet with Yasser Arafat, something that I was not disposed to do, because she was the belief you never know what can come out of an encounter. We did have a meeting. I was part of Jean Chrétien's first ever parliamentary mission to the Middle East. There's a funny story here. Well, I'll leave it because I don't want to take up the time with it. But that Speak No Evil was something that perhaps if we had adopted it, we might have been able to preempt some of the discourse polarizing, toxic discourse that is more omnipresent in today's Parliament than it ever was when I was a parliamentarian. We were able to work across parliamentary lines, and I regret that this is not taking place today. For example, Foreign Minister, the Conservatives, John Baird, has mentioned on a number of times that we cooperated more together, the two of us, and he sometimes cooperated with his own party. So working across party lines for me was important because of that lesson from John Turner, that we are trustees of the people. Or, as my father, when he took me to Parliament by 11 years old, outside the House of Commons, looking at the Parliament, said to me, "Son," and he used the line, "Son, this is Vox Populi. This is the voice of the people. Never forget that." Took me to the Supreme Court and said, "This is the guardian of the people, of the rule of law. Never forget that." Took me to the tomb of the unknown. Said, "Son, these are the people who stand on guard for us here." So these were important, parental lessons that I sought to act upon. And the Speak No Evil was an embodiment of that. And I just wish Parliament would not so much adopt such a motion today, but act on what that motion intended.
One of the most prominent things you've done since politics was your involvement with the adoption of the Magnitsky Act, which is named after the tax accountant Sergei Magnitsky, who was found dead in a Moscow prison after uncovering a corruption ring in 2008. The legislation targets individuals deemed guilty of human rights abuses and closes down their access to the West's financial system. It's now been adopted in, I think, 35 countries. Has that had the impact that you hoped for? Because you talk about regimes operating with impunity, and this would seem to restrict that impunity somewhat.
Well, I think it has had the desired effect. There are limits to what these sanctions can do. I was just recently in discussions with Bill Browder. We not only talked about the fact that 35 countries have adopted it, and they're more on the way. And these are the community of democracies. We've not had any of the axis of evil, but we've been able to get the sanctioning of many officials within the axis of evil countries. The whole global Magnitsky sanctions movement. Our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights is a co-chair of the Civil Society Coalition for Magnitsky Sanctions, and we are constantly presenting to the Canadian government lists of those who need to be sanctioned. For example, in 2018, we released a report with respect to Iran realizing rights over repression. We identified 19 major architects of repression in Iran, and we have managed to get many of them sanctioned. That has not ended that culture of impunity, but it has at least resulted in accountability, and as Bill Browder intended, the whole thing is to provide justice for victims. It's important for the victims to see that a semblance of justice is being sought and being achieved, however imperfectly, and that there is accountability here too, however imperfectly. So we've had hundreds sanctioned from Russia, from Venezuela, from Iran, from China. We just recently met again and presented a sanctions list growing out of the mass atrocities of October 7th. So yes, people are being sanctioned and being held accountable. Not enough. Culture of impunity continues. For that, we may need not just individual sanction measures, but what we need, as I say, is the democracies to mobilize to take all the other initiatives that we mentioned. Magnitsky sanctions alone will not do it. But I remember when I first introduced Magnitsky sanctions legislation as an MP, 2011, and I was there with Vladimir Kara-Murza at the time, who joined me, and Boris Nemtsov, the great Russian opposition leader at the time, who was tragically assassinated outside the Kremlin in 2005. 2015. And I remember we were asked at a conference, isn't that legislation, isn't that anti-Russian? And Boris Nemtsov and Kara-Murza answered, I said, no. They said, this is the most pro-Russian legislation you could adopt. This is legislation on behalf of the Russian people. This is holding the Russian violators accountable. This is giving the Russian people a voice. This is giving victims a measure of justice. So that's something I never forgot. As I said, Boris Nemtsov paid the price for it, and being Vladimir Kara-Murza, who came to testify before our Foreign Affairs Committee for the adoption of Magnitsky sanctions in 2015 and 2017, and when they were adopted, both times was poisoned after he returned to Russia. So the architects of Magnitsky sanctions paid a great price. And so the least that we can do is do as much as we can to make those sanctions effective, both in their scope, their scale, and their impact.
You've had a front row seat as history has unfolded in the second half of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century. One story which I didn't know, I picked up this week. I gather you acted as an emissary carrying a peace negotiation proposal from Egypt's Anwar Sadat to Israel's Menachem Begin in the late 70s. And I believe that the wedding photo behind you from 1979, or your wedding was on the same day that peace broke out between the two. How did that come about? And are there any more incidents of that magnitude that we don't know about?
Well, how I used to live and work in the Arab countries for 4 months every summer, 75, 76, 77, 78. People ask me, why are you going there? And I said, because, I want to work on peace between Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and Arab states, and I have to have a better understanding, not just the foreign policies was sometimes called for, the Arab state, I said, but the culture, the psychology of the people themselves, of the Egyptian people, the Jordanian, Palestinian people. So I would spend, 4 months every summer in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Palestinian territories, and end up always in Israel. And I began for a month each time in Egypt at the Institute of Political and Strategic Studies at Al-Ahram. And I got to know Boutros Ghali in 75 and 76 when I was there each month that I was there, because he was then the head of the Institute. In 77, I'm back again in Cairo, back at the Institute, and Boutros Ghali is now the Foreign Affairs Minister in Egypt. And he knew about my goings after Egypt to the other Arab countries, and then I would end up in Israel. To sum it up quickly, he invited me to a meeting with Sadat, who asked me basically two questions after long conversations. The first was, could he make peace with the then newly elected Likud government? And I said, yes, I believe you can, and they will carry the other parties. He said, can I make peace with the newly elected Prime Minister Menachem Begin? I said, I don't know Prime Minister Begin. I said, but he's known to me as being a parliamentarian, a Democrat. I believe he would want to make peace with the most significant and an important Arab country, that being Egypt. And so he then gave me a message to bring to Prime Minister Begin, and I said to President, I said, I don't know a Prime Minister Begin. He said, I know. He said, but from what Boutros Ghali tells me, I know you'll find a way to bring this message somehow to Prime Minister Begin. I know he tells me that you go to Israel after your meetings in the Arab countries, and I want to have this message taken by somebody who the Israelis would trust and whom I trust. And so I cut the rest of my trip short that summer. I just went to Syria and then continued to Israel. And fortuitously, on the day that I arrived in Israel, I met a friend of mine who invited me to a meeting of younger parliamentarians of the Israeli parliament. Sitting there was my future wife-to-be, and you mentioned the married. We did not know each other, but why that trip had a transformative impact on my life. I then was asked by this friend of mine, Uri Gordon, to say a few words, as he said, about the Jewish communities in US and Canada. And I got up and I spoke in Hebrew, and I said, you've heard enough about the Jewish communities in North America. Let me speak about my trip to Egypt and to Syria. And I did not make any reference at all to the message from Sadat. My wife at the time, my wife-to-be, was sitting there and wrote a message to her friend when she was listening to me. This person must be a spy for the Arabs, because at that point in '77, Jews weren't traveling freely in the Arab countries as I was, and in fact, I ended up, I won't go into that, being arrested in Syria and threatened with execution in 1978, but we'll leave that aside. Got rescued there. But so she came up to me at the end of that lunch and started to ask me some questions, and I realized that she was suspicious of me. So then I told her a story. I said something I hadn't said over lunch. I said, when I was in Syria and I met with the Damascus Jewish community, they drank a toast, as they called it, a l'chaim, to the election of Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and said, with him will come our redemption. She heard this. He said, you have to meet with the Prime Minister of Israel. He needs to know this. And I said, which was true, I don't know the Prime Minister of Israel. And she said, I will arrange it. She was then the parliamentary secretary of the Likud party, one of Menachem Begin's closest confidants. She arranged the meeting. I shared the message with Menachem Begin. I won't go into the rest of it. Negotiations began, and the rest is history. And we got married on March 25th, 1979, because that was the day of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty.
Incredible. It sounds like a movie script.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that Sadat was a great heroic leader. So was Menachem Begin. And one of the interesting things about President Sadat is, remember when Prime Minister Begin asked me if I thought he could make peace with President Sadat, same question that Sadat asked me whether he could make peace with, and I said yes, and in particular because his wife, President Sadat, very much wants that peace, and she was present at the meetings that I had. So you see, spouses can help make history, and I've seen that as well with the political prisoners that I've had the privilege to represent, that it's because of their spouses and their advocacy on the outside that they ended up being released, whether it was Avital Sharansky, who became his voice and his identity while he was in the Gulag for close to 9 years, or whether more recently for Vladimir Kara-Murza, when his wife, Evgeny Kara-Murza, became his voice, these very courageous spouses, have really been at the forefront of human rights struggles, and that is true not only with respect to Russia, but true with respect to Iran, true with respect to China, other places where I've represented political prisoners.
Let's round off with this. You told me some years ago that you believed in Martin Luther King's aphorism that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends in the direction of justice. Given all that we spoke about over the last hour, the rise of a concerted axis of evil, transnational repression and assassination, growing anti-Semitism, domestic polarization in modern democracies, do you still have faith that justice will prevail?
I still have that faith. I'm an optimistic person by nature. That also was bequeathed to me by my parents. And I think Martin Luther King paid the price, the greatest of prices for his heroism, because he was assassinated. But I think what Martin Luther King aphorisms about that the arc of history will bend towards justice, at the end of the day did do so in the United States because of people like Martin Luther King. And what he epitomized was that we have to work to bend that arc towards justice. That we have it in our hands to do so. I might quote, because that Martin Luther King Jr.'s aphorism is also part of the Jewish tradition, and finds expression in another saying of the sage philosopher Maimonides, who said that we should each see the world as divided into half evil and half good. Therefore, any good deed by any one of us on any given day, converts the cosmos from evil to good. So we, each one of us, by one good deed on every day, can have a transformative impact on the pursuit of justice. So that lesson was never lost on me. And I think the great heroic figures, the Vladimir Kara-Murzas, the Sharanskys, the Nasrin Sotoudehs in Iran, the Wang Bizangs in China, all these have paid a price, but they have shown that they are bending their countries towards justice, and we have to join them, the community of democracies, so that individually and collectively we can help implement Martin Luther King's hope and dream that he implemented of bending the arc towards justice.
Irwin, it's been my privilege to talk to you today. Stay safe, keep up the good fight. I think the answer to the Filipino voters question in Mount Royal in 2011, when he asked how many people in the world are like you, I think the answer is pretty clear: very few. So thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm a great follower of your columns on a regular basis. One other interesting thing about that campaign, I was visiting mosques. The Mount Royal riding is known to have a significant Jewish presence. It also has a significant Muslim presence. And I got a significant portion of the Muslim vote at the time. It's one of the ironies of that election. I lost the Jewish vote by 3-1, but I won the Muslim vote, the Filipino vote, as you said, the African-Canadian vote. But one of the interesting things is I was visiting a mosque in that election, and I had a Q&A, and afterwards one of the members of the congregation got up and said, "No, Professor Cotler, we don't have any problems with you, we're pleased with all that you're doing, except for one thing." And I said, "What is that?" And they said to me, same-sex marriage. We didn't believe that we would come here and we would have, same-sex marriage. So I said to them, well, I just came from a synagogue and I heard the same thing from some of the rabbis in that synagogue. So you have to acknowledge that on this issue, I've really united you guys. So that was a part of my campaign. I've maintained good relations since then, both with the Muslim and the Jewish communities. And interestingly enough, one of my first acts, with this I'll close, as Justice Minister, was to have a national justice initiative against racism and hate, and to establish a council on national security that was co-chaired then by both a Jew and a Muslim. I wish we could do this today. I'm very worried in the fractured domestic environment. We've talked about it in Parliament, but even amongst our publics, that sense of allyship has eroded, and we need to get that back.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you come back one day. You can tell us, fill us in about the story about being arrested in Syria in 1978 and how you escaped from that. Thanks again.
Okay, and I look forward not only to reading your articles, but to meeting your daughter and having a conversation with her.
I hope that happens. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Take care.